The air inside Liquidation Bay 42 did not just smell of unwashed bodies and recycled oxygen, it tasted of rusted copper and the sharp metallic tang of industrial-grade fear. It was the scent of hope being stripped down for parts and sold to the highest bidder. Kaelen Vance adjusted the filter mask on his face, though it did little to block the stench. He had spent the last 3 months drifting through 17 different sectors, hopping from one mining outpost to another, looking for something that did not involve blood or misery. He told himself he was just a merchant, a man of schedules and spreadsheets. Saffron from the southern nebulae was fetching 4 times its weight in the core systems, and he had a hold full of it. He told himself a lot of things to keep the nightmares at bay, but the reality of Onyx 9 was a stubborn beast that refused to be ignored. This particular market was tucked into the hollowed-out carcass of a dead moon, a jagged rock where the law of the Central Syndicate was nothing more than a faint whisper, drowned out by the roar of plasma torches. Kaelen had walked past dozens of stalls today, ignoring the rows of decommissioned droids and the crates of stolen medtech. He had a plan. 80,000 marks. That was the magic number. It was the price of a permanent shop in the Citadel, a place where the air was filtered 3 times over and the gravity did not make his knees ache. It was a ticket out of the grime. He should have kept walking. He knew the path to the docking rings by heart. But then he saw the cage at the far end of the bay, draped in heavy electromagnetic shielding. It was the kind of containment used for high-risk assets, the ones that refused to acknowledge they were items on a ledger. Inside, standing nearly 2.5 meters tall, even with her massive shoulders hunched, was a Varg-class bioconstruct. Her skin was a deep, bruised emerald, marked with jagged white scars that traced a history Kaelen did not want to read. Her hair was a matted tangle of black fibers, framing a face that was built for the harsh pressures of a gas giant's core. But it was her eyes that made Kaelen stop mid-step. Most bioconstructs had eyes that were dull, clouded by the haze of the neural damper that kept them docile. Her eyes, however, were wide and burning with an ancient, unfiltered fire. It was not hope. Hope was a luxury that vanished after the first dozen neural shocks. No, her eyes held something far more dangerous. Memory. She remembered a time before the chains. She remembered that she was not a product. "You looking for a heavy lifter? Scrapper?" The voice came from behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. It belonged to Malcolm Thresh, a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment and whose smile was as sharp as a monomolecular blade. He was leaning against a pillar, cleaning his fingernails with a vibro shiv, looking like a vulture waiting for a heart to stop beating. Kaelen forced his voice to remain steady. "What is her designation?" Thresh spat a glob of stim tobacco onto the deck plating. "Unit Zaya 7, High G laborer, custom built for the Titan mines." "She is a piece of work, that one. Separated from her battalion during the border wars 6 years ago. Caught by a salvage crew. She has been through 5 owners since then. The first one tried to put her in the underground pits. She tore through 3 opponents before she stopped fighting for the crowd. The second thought he could use her as a bodyguard. She broke his arm in 4 places when he tried to adjust her settings. The last one? Well, let us just say his habitat module had a catastrophic decompression. Funny thing about that, the logs showed the door was opened from the inside. Thresh looked at the Varg with a mixture of professional annoyance and grudging respect. She is smart, lethal, and she has not been broken yet. Honestly, at this point, she is more of a liability than an asset. I am shipping her to the scrap processing plants on the capital moon tomorrow, if no one takes her. At least there, I can get back the value of her raw biomass. The Varg had not moved during the conversation. She remained as still as a statue carved from green stone, her gaze fixed on a flickering neon sign across the bay. But Kaelen noticed her hands. They were wrapped around the bars of the cage, her knuckles pale against the emerald skin. On her left wrist, hidden beneath a layer of filth and torn fabric, there was a glint of dark, non-reflective metal. A band of some kind, intricately carved. She had wrapped it in scraps of leather, trying to hide it. It was the only thing in the entire universe that still belonged to her. How much, Kaelen heard himself ask. The words felt like they were spoken by someone else. Someone who had not spent 10 years calculating the cost of every breath. Thresh's eyebrows shot up. For the Varg? You are kidding me, Vance. You are a scrap hauler, not a gladiator. You want that one? She will kill you in your sleep before you clear the atmosphere. 80,000 marks, Kaelen said, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was everything. Every credit he had saved, every deal he had brokered, every lie he had told himself about a quiet life in the Citadel. It was his entire future, condensed into a single number. Thresh stopped picking at his nails. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the profit. 80,000 for a defective unit? You are either the saint of the sector or the biggest fool I have ever met. Either way, your marks are as good as anyone else's. Kaelen did not look at Thresh. He looked at the Varg. She had turned her head now, her burning eyes locked onto his. She was not looking for a savior. She was looking at the man who was about to become her next prison warden. I want the papers, Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave. Full ownership transfer, irrevocable. No backdoor access codes for the manufacturer. I want it done by the book, Thresh. If I find a single tracker in her that is not on the ledger, I will come back for my change. Thresh let out a dry, rattling laugh. Fine by me, Scrapper. You want the headache? You pay for the medicine. Give me 20 minutes to finalize the biolink. 20 minutes later, Kaelen stood before the cage as the electromagnetic field hissed and died. The door slid open with a sound like a dying star. The Varg did not move. She remained in the corner, a coiled spring of muscle and resentment. You can come out now, Kaelen said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too soft for a place like this. She did not respond. Her eyes tracked every movement he made, scanning for the shimmer of a shock baton or the glint of a sedative needle. Look, I am not going to hurt you, Kaelen added, then immediately regretted it. It was a hollow phrase, the kind of thing people said right before they did exactly that. Zaya 7 finally spoke. Her voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the bay. It was a voice that belonged on a battlefield, not in a cage. Humans always say that, she said, the words heavy with a jagged edge, right before they turn on the damper. She stepped out of the cage then, and for a moment, Kaelen truly understood why Thresh was afraid of her. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace that defied her massive size. She was a storm contained in a skin of emerald, a force of nature that had been forced into a box. She stood a full head taller than him, the scent of ozone and ancient earth clinging to her rags. She did not run. She did not strike him. She simply stood there in the harsh, artificial light of the bay, blinking as if she had forgotten what it felt like to exist without a cage around her. Come on, Kaelen said, turning toward the exit. Let's get you out of this hole. She followed him, but she did not follow like a slave. She followed like a soldier who was scouting the terrain, her eyes darting to every guard and every security camera. Kaelen felt the weight of her presence behind him, a constant reminder that he had just traded his entire life for a problem he did not know how to solve. The walk through the station was a gauntlet of stairs. In a place where everyone was a predator or prey, a scrapper walking alongside a 7-foot Varg class was a beacon of trouble. Mothers pulled their children away from the railing. Mercenaries at the bars stopped their drinking to whisper and point. Shopkeepers tightened their grip on their shotguns. Kaelen felt a hot flash of anger rise in his chest, not at the Varg, but at the world that had decided her worth was measured in marks and biomass. Zaya's face remained an unreadable mask. She had learned long ago that human hatred was as predictable as the station's artificial tides. She walked with her head high, her gaze fixed on the back of Kaelen's head, her hands twitching near her sides. They reached the airlock of Kaelen's ship, the Star Grazed, a mid-range hauler that had seen better decades. It was a labyrinth of exposed wires and cramped corridors, smelling of oil and old coffee. It was not much, but it was private. Kaelen hit the cycle button, and the airlock hissed shut, sealing out the noise and the filth of Onyx 9. He turned to her, gesturing toward the small living area. You can stay here. There is a bunk, a nutrient dispenser, and a wash station. I will be in the cockpit. Zaya looked around the room as if she were expecting a trap to spring from the ceiling. She didn't enter. Why? Why what? Kaelen asked, leaning against the bulkhead. Why did you buy me? You have no guards. You have no whips. You have no purpose for a warrior on a ship this small. Kaelen looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he did not see a Varg or a bioconstruct or a heavy lifter. He saw a person who was tired of being hunted. Because I was tired of looking at that cage, he said quietly, and because I think you were too. She was silent for a long beat, her emerald knuckles tightening around the strap of her rags. You are a fool, human. Yeah, Kaelen sighed, turning back to the controls. I have been told that before. The star-grazed hummed with the steady vibration of its sublight engines. Kaelen sat in the pilot's chair, his hands resting on the worn flight yokes, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept checking the internal sensors, watching the small blip that represented Zaya in the crew quarters. She had not moved for 3 hours. She was sitting on the floor in the corner furthest from the door, a position that allowed her to see every possible entrance. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small hexagonal device. It was the master key to her neural damper. Thresh had handed it to him with a smirk, calling it the remote control for the beast. It was a piece of technology that could send a paralyzing shock through her nervous system or, worse, shut down her higher brain functions entirely, turning her into a literal vegetable. It was the ultimate leash. Kaelen looked at the device, then at the sensor blip. He felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. He had spent his life salvaging junk, repairing things that were broken. This was not a tool. It was an atrocity. He stood up and walked back to the living area. The door slid open, and Zaya was on her feet in an instant. Her body coiled, her hands curled into fists that could crush a titanium hull. I brought you some gear, Kaelen said, holding up a bundle of standard-issue fatigues and a pair of industrial-grade grav sleeves. Those rags you're wearing won't do much once we hit the cold sectors. And these sleeves will help with the gravity shifts. The ship's internal plating can be a bit wonky. Zaya didn't move. She stared at the clothes as if they were poisoned. What do you want in return? Kaelen set the bundle on the table. Nothing. I already told you. She let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. Nothing is free in this galaxy, Scrapper. You want labor? You want a guard? Or do you want something more disgusting? I have seen what humans do with my kind when the cameras are off. Kaelen's face burned. I am not one of them, Zaya. I am just a man who made a very expensive mistake because I couldn't stand the smell of that market anymore. He took the master key from his pocket and held it out to her, palm up. Zaya froze. Her eyes darted from the device to Kaelen's face and back again. What are you doing? This is the key to your damper, Kaelen said, his voice steady. Thresh told me I could use it to break you, but I don't want a broken thing on my ship. I want a partner, or at least, I want someone who isn't planning to kill me the moment I turn my back. He set the key on the table next to the clothes. The code is 4029. It's yours. Use it to unlock the safety or smash it into pieces. I don't care, but as long as you are on this ship, you are not property. You are a passenger. Zaya stared at the key as if it were a live grenade. Her hand reached out, then pulled back, her emerald skin pale with tension. This is a trick, a test to see if I will rebel. It's not a test, Zaya. It's a choice. Kaelen turned toward the door. I'm going to make some coffee. There is a nutrient pack on the counter if you are hungry. Real food, not that sludge they feed the constructs in the bays. He left the room without waiting for a reply. He spent the next hour in the galley, listening to the silence of the ship. Every creak of the hull made him jump. Every hiss of the ventilation felt like a warning. He was waiting for the sound of the airlock opening, or the sound of her heavy footsteps coming to end him. Instead, there was a faint metallic click. A few minutes later, Zaya walked into the galley. She was wearing the fatigues, which were slightly too small for her massive frame, but served their purpose. The grav sleeves were buckled onto her wrists, humming with a soft blue light. She looked more like a soldier now and less like a victim. The key, she said, holding it up between two thick fingers. I didn't smash it. Why not? She looked at him with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Because if I smash it, I can never be sure you don't have another one hidden away. If I keep it, I know exactly where the danger is. Kaelen nodded. Smart. I can live with that. She sat down at the small table, her size making the entire galley feel cramped. She looked at the cup of coffee in his hand. What is that smell? Coffee. It's a stimulant. Tastes like burnt dirt, but it keeps the brain firing. You want some? She shook her head. My biology does not react well to human toxins. I will stick to the nutrient packs. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the ship and the distant whistle of the vacuum outside. It was a fragile piece, one built on a foundation of 80,000 marks and a desperate hope for something better. We are heading for the rim, Kaelen said, breaking the silence. It is a long haul, about 3 weeks at subwarp. Once we get there, I have some contacts. We can find you a place where the syndicate doesn't look too closely, a place where you can be whatever you want. Zaya leaned back, her eyes narrowing. And you? What do you get out of this, Kaelen Vance? You spent your life savings on a construct you don't even want to use. You are heading to a lawless sector with no cargo and no plan. You have lost everything. Kaelen looked into his coffee, seeing his own reflection in the dark liquid. I didn't lose everything, Zaya. I bought back something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. What is that? My ability to look in the mirror without wanting to break it, he said quietly. Zaya didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. For the first time, the fire in her eyes dimmed just a fraction, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. The piece lasted exactly 6 hours. It ended when the long-range scanners in the cockpit began to scream. Kaelen bolted from the galley, Zaya right behind him, her movements effortless in the ship's shifting gravity. What is it? She barked, her hand instinctively going to her left wrist, where the dark metal band was still hidden beneath her sleeve. Kaelen slammed into the pilot's chair and brought up the tactical display. A ship had just dropped out of warp 3 kilometers off their stern. It was a sleek black interceptor, devoid of any markings except for a single, stylized gear on the hull. Synaptic dynamics, Kaelen cursed, his fingers flying across the console. It's a recovery vessel. Zaya's face went deathly pale. They found me. They shouldn't have been able to, Kaelen said, his voice tight. Thresh said the link was clean. He swore there were no trackers. Zaya reached up and touched the back of her neck, where the neural damper was buried under her skin. They don't need a tracker for my kind. They have my signature. I am a bioconstruct, Kaelen. I am a radio tower for their sensors as long as this thing is inside me. The comms channel crackled to life, filling the cockpit with a voice that sounded like grinding stones. This is Agent Vaxon Cray of Synaptic Dynamics. You are in possession of stolen corporate property, Unit Zaya 7. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with lethal force. You have 60 seconds to comply. Kaelen looked at the screen, then at Zaya. She was standing there, her fists clenched, the fire in her eyes returning with a vengeance. She looked like she was ready to tear the ship apart herself before she let them take her back. What do we do? She asked, her voice a low growl. Kaelen gripped the flight yokes, his knuckles turning white. He thought about the Citadel. He thought about the shop he would never own and the quiet life he would never lead. Then he thought about the cage in Bay 42. We move, Kaelen said, his voice hard. Grab onto something, Zaya. This is going to get bumpy. He slammed the throttles forward, and the Star Grays roared as its engines pushed past their safety limits. Behind them, the black interceptor began to fire, bolts of blue plasma tearing through the void, seeking the heart of their freedom. Kaelen didn't look back. He had made his choice, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't care about the cost. The Star Grazed was never built for atmospheric dogfights or high-speed intercept maneuvers. It was a hauler, a heavy-bellied beast designed to carry tons of ore across the silent reaches of the void. Now, as 3 bolts of high-intensity plasma scorched the space where the cockpit had been a second before, the ship groaned in a way that sounded uncomfortably like a death rattle. Kaelen Vance gripped the flight yokes until his knuckles turned as white as the stars passing by. His eyes were glued to the tactical overlay, where a red triangular icon, the Synaptic Dynamics Interceptor, was closing the gap with terrifying efficiency. We have a problem, Kaelen grunted, his voice vibrating with the ship's erratic tremors. That interceptor is a Blackwing class. It has 6 pulse thrusters and a localized warp spike. We cannot outrun them in open water. Zaya stood behind him, her massive hand braced against the ceiling. The grav sleeves on her wrist were pulsing a deep, rhythmic blue, helping her heart pump blood against the three gravities of acceleration. Her breathing was heavy, a rhythmic huffing that filled the cramped cockpit. "What is the play, Scrapper? Do we turn and fight?" "With what?" Kaelen barked, throwing the ship into a sharp lateral roll. "My cargo loader?" "We have no teeth, Zaya. If they get a tractor lock, it is game over. We will be back on Onyx 9 by midnight, and I will be looking at a life sentence in a labor colony." He scanned the sector map, searching for a ghost of a chance. To their left lay the empty expanse of the Dead Reach. To their right, looming like a wall of jagged glass, was the Ethel Belt. The locals called it the Shards. It was the remains of a terraformed planet that had been shattered during the first expansion, a chaotic graveyard of frozen oceans, twisted metal, and radioactive rock. No sane pilot entered the Shards without a high-grade navigation computer and a death wish. "We are going into the Shards," Kaelen said, his decision tasting like copper and adrenaline. Zaya leaned over his shoulder, her emerald eyes narrowing as she looked at the chaotic mess on the radar. "Those rocks are moving at 500 kilometers an hour. Most of them are too small for the scanners to pick up until they are through the hull." "You are talking about suicide." "Maybe," Kaelen muttered, shifting the power from the life support systems to the forward shields. But Synaptic Dynamics doesn't like scratching their shiny black paint. They are corporate vultures, not void jumpers. If we can make it to the inner core of the belt, we can ghost our signal in the radiation. It is our only shot at a clean break. The ship bucked violently as a plasma bolt clipped the starboard engine nacelle. Alarms began to blare, a shrill, rhythmic screaming that echoed through the corridors. Kaelen ignored the warning lights. He pushed the throttles until they clicked into the override position. The Star Greys surged forward, diving headlong into the debris field. The transition was instantaneous. One moment they were in the clear, dark void. The next, the universe was filled with spinning ice and jagged stone. Kaelen felt the vibration through his boots, the tiny, terrifying pitter-patter of micrometeors sandblasting the hull. He was flying by instinct now, his hands moving across the controls in a frantic dance. He felt every mile of the journey in his teeth. He wasn't just a merchant anymore. He was a scavenger hunting for a gap between the teeth of a giant. "Keep your head on a swivel, Zaya," Kaelen shouted over the roar of the atmospheric scrubbers. "I need you to watch the aft scanners. If that interceptor follows us, I need to know the second they lock on." Zaya dropped into the co-pilot's seat, her frame barely fitting into the reinforced chair. Her fingers, thick and powerful, hovered over the sensor array. She moved with a strange, jittery energy, her head twitching every few seconds. Kaelen noticed it but didn't have the breath to ask. He was too busy weaving between a chunk of a frozen skyscraper and a massive slab of iron ore. "They are still on us," Zaya reported, her voice straining. "They are burning hot. They don't care about the paint, Kaelen. They want the asset. They want me. They're going to have to work for it," Kaelen said. He pulled the nose up, skimming the surface of a moving ice moonlet so close that the ship's heat wash carved a steaming trench in the frost. Suddenly, Zaya let out a sharp, choked cry. She slumped forward, her forehead slamming against the console. Her entire body began to convulse, her emerald skin rippling as if something was crawling beneath the surface. "Zaya!" Kaelen yelled, not daring to take his eyes off the debris. "What is it? What happened?" "The damper?" she gasped, her voice fractured and high-pitched. "It's spiking. The feedback. The radiation from the belt. It's overloading the circuit." Kaelen felt a cold spike of dread. He knew what a neural spike could do to a bioconstruct. It was designed to punish disobedience, but in a high-radiation environment like the Shards, the hardware could malfunction, sending thousands of volts of corrective energy directly into the brain. It was a slow-motion execution. "Fight it," Kaelen urged, dodging a spinning girder that could have sheared the cockpit in half. "We are almost at the core. Just 10 more minutes." "I can't," she whispered, her hands clawing at the deck plating. "It feels like my head is being crushed by a hydraulic press." Kaelen looked at the tactical display. The Synaptic Interceptor was struggling, its sleeker hull taking more damage from the micro-debris than the Star-grazed industrial armor. They were falling back, but only slightly. He had to end this now. Ahead of them lay the heart of Ethel, the largest remaining chunk of the planet's core. It was a massive, jagged sphere of magnetic iron, spinning slowly and generating a chaotic EM field that scrambled everything within 50 kilometers. If they could get inside the fissures of the core, they would be invisible. "Hang on," Kaelen screamed. He killed the main engines, letting the ship's momentum carry them toward a narrow canyon in the iron core. He used the thrusters to pivot, sliding the star-grazed into the darkness of the fissure like a knife into a sheath. The world went black. The screaming alarms died away as the magnetic field of the core swallowed their signal. The star-grazed drifted into the silent, cold embrace of the Iron Mountain. Kaelen waited, his heart pounding, as he watched the external cameras. A minute passed, then two. The black interceptor appeared on the edge of the canyon, its searchlights cutting through the dust. It hovered there for a long time, a silent predator peering into the dark. But the shards were unforgiving. A stray chunk of ice slammed into the interceptor's wing, forcing it to bank away. After what felt like an eternity, the red triangle on the radar turned and accelerated back toward the edge of the belt. "They're gone," Kaelen whispered, the air leaving his lungs in a long, shaky hiss. "We lost them." He turned to the co-pilot's seat, his relief vanishing instantly. Zaya was slumped over, her breathing shallow and ragged. A thin line of green blood was leaking from her ear, and her eyes were rolled back in her head. The neural damper on the back of her neck was glowing a sickly, pulsating orange. "No," Kaelen said, unbuckling his harness. "No, you don't. You don't die on me now." He hauled her out of the seat, her massive weight nearly crushing him against the bulkhead. He dragged her toward the living area, his mind racing through every scrap of medical knowledge he had ever scavenged. He had 80,000 marks of debt in a ship that was held together by spit and prayer, but right now, all that mattered was the person bleeding out on his floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the master key he had given her. It was still there, tucked into her belt. He had told her she was free, but the technology didn't care about his philosophy. The technology only knew how to own and how to destroy. "I'm going to fix this, Zaya," he muttered, though she couldn't hear him. "I promise, I'm going to fix this." The living quarters of the star-grazed felt smaller than usual. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, rhythmic shadows across Zaya's face as she lay on the floor. Kaelen had cleared the table and moved her onto a heavy-duty cargo pallet, his muscles screaming from the effort. He had a portable medkit open beside him, but the tools inside were designed for human flesh, not for the complex biosynthetic architecture of a Varg class. He worked with a laser scalpel in one hand and a cooling spray in the other. He had to be precise. The neural damper was a D-series suppressant, a cruel piece of engineering that was woven directly into her primary spinal column. It wasn't just a device, it was a parasite. It monitored her dopamine levels, her adrenaline, and her serotonin. If she felt too much anger, too much joy, too much will, the damper would fire, dampening the signal. But the radiation from the ethyl belt had fried the regulator. Now it was just firing at random, sending white-hot agony through her nervous system. Zaya groaned, her hand twitching, her fingers seeking a weapon that wasn't there. "Kill me," she rasped, her eyes fluttering open. Her pupils were blown out, black voids in a sea of emerald. "Stop it, please." "Shut up," Kaelen said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I didn't spend my retirement fund so you could take the easy way out. I'm a scrapper, remember? I fix things that people throw away. And you are a lot of things, Zaya, but you are not garbage." He applied the cooling spray to the base of her skull, the frost masking the smell of burnt hair and ozone. He had to find the bypass shunt. Every piece of synaptic dynamics hardware had a failsafe, a way for a technician to disable the unit without killing the asset. The problem was finding it in the dark, on a vibrating ship without a manual. He leaned in close, his breath hitching as he saw the intricate detail of her anatomy. Beneath the scars and the dirt, her skin was beautiful, a complex weave of reinforced fibers and bioluminescent capillaries. She wasn't just a biological being. She was a work of art, a masterpiece of forbidden science, and the damper was a graffiti mark across the center of it. "I see it," he whispered. The shunt was a tiny, gold-plated contact point buried deep near the second vertebrae. He took a deep breath, steadying his hands. If he missed by a millimeter, he would sever her motor control. She would be a prisoner in her own body forever. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Vance, he muttered to himself, repeating a mantra his father had taught him. It's doing the job while your hands are shaking. He pressed the laser scalpel to the contact point. There was a sharp hiss, a spark of blue light, and the orange glow of the damper vanished. Zaya's body went limp. The tension that had been coiled in her muscles for 6 years seemed to evaporate in a single second. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her head falling back against the pallet. The green blood stopped flowing. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic thrumming of the ship's life support. Kaelen slumped back against the bulkhead, the laser scalpel falling from his numb fingers. He stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He felt exhausted, a deep, bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He had spent his whole life trying to be invisible, trying to stay in the gray areas where the law and the corporations didn't look. Now he was the primary target of a synaptic dynamics recovery team, and he was nursing a bioconstruct back to health in a hollowed-out iron rock. "You are a real gearhead, aren't you?" Kaelen started, his eyes snapping to Zaya. She was awake. Her eyes were still bloodshot, but the clarity was back. The fire was there, though it was burning low, like embers in a hearth. "I've been called worse," Kaelen said, offering her a weak smile. "How do you feel?" "Like I was hit by a freighter," she said, trying to sit up. "Stay down," Kaelen ordered. "I only bypassed the regulator. The hardware is still in there. If you move too fast, you'll trigger a manual reboot. You need to rest." Zaya ignored him, pushing herself up into a sitting position with a grunt of pain. She touched the back of her neck, her fingers tracing the path of the surgery. "You saved me. Again." "I'm starting to think it's a habit," Kaelen said. He reached over and handed her a flask of water. "Drink. Your electrolytes are probably shot." She took the flask, her large hands dwarfing it. She drank deeply, the water spilling down her chin. When she finished, she looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you let it finish me? It would have been easier. You could have taken the ship and disappeared. You would have been free of the debt and the hunt." Kaelen looked at her, his gaze steady. "You keep asking me why, Zaya. You're looking for a logic that isn't there. In my world, things have a price. A crate of saffron, a ship's engine, a mark on a ledger. But people don't have prices. Not really. We just pretend they do, so we don't have to feel bad about what we do to them." He stood up and began packing the medkit. "I bought your freedom because I wanted to prove to myself that I still could, that the universe hadn't turned me into another Thresh. If I let you die on my floor, then the 80,000 marks didn't buy anything. It would have just been a down payment on my own soul." Zaya was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the grav sleeves on her wrists, then at the dark metal band she had hidden so carefully. She reached out and unwrapped the leather scraps, revealing the black iron bracelet in the dim light. The runes on it seemed to glow with a faint inner light, reflecting the bioluminescence of her skin. "This is from my clan," she said, her voice soft. "The Iron Wind. We lived on the peaks of Velonis Prime. We weren't built in a lab, Kaelen. Not originally. We were a people, a culture. Synaptic dynamics didn't create us. They harvested us. They took our children and mapped our genomes and turned our heritage into a patent." She held the bracelet toward him. "This was given to me by my father. He told me that as long as I wore it, the Iron Wind was at my back, that I was never alone, even in the dark. For 6 years, I kept it hidden. I let them take my name. I let them take my strength. But they couldn't take the wind." Kaelen reached out, his fingers brushing the cold iron of the bracelet. "It's beautiful. It's a weight," she said, "a reminder of everything I lost. But today, when the damper was spiking, I didn't think about the pain. I thought about the mountains. I thought about the way the sky looks when the 3 suns of Velonis set at the same time. I realized I didn't want to die in a cage. I wanted to see the sky again." She looked at Kaelen, and for the first time, she didn't see a human. She saw a warrior, one who fought with a wrench and a laser scalpel instead of a spear. "Thank you, Kaelen Vance." Kaelen felt a lump in his throat. "Don't thank me yet. We're still in the middle of a magnetic storm. Our engine is smoking, and we have the most powerful corporation in the sector looking for us. We're not out of the woods, Zaya. Not by a long shot. I know, she said, her voice gaining strength. But for the first time in 6 years, I am not being hunted alone. That makes a difference. Kaelen nodded, turning back to the cockpit. He had to check the scanners, had to see if the interceptor was really gone, or if they were just waiting for them to emerge from the core. He had a million problems to solve, but as he sat back in the pilot's chair, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The star-grazed was a junker. He was a failed merchant. And Zaya was a broken warrior. But together they were a ghost in the machine, a glitch in the corporate ledger that refused to be erased. We'll stay here for a few more hours, Kaelen called back to the living area. Let the heat sig dissipate. Then we'll bug out through the northern rim of the belt. I have a friend in Sector 7, a man named Vance. He's an outcast doctor, a real scratch medic. If anyone can get that damper out of you for good, it's him. Zaya leaned her head against the bulkhead, her eyes closing as she finally allowed herself to rest. Sector 7. It's a long way. Every journey is, Kaelen said, his hands moving over the navigation computer. But we have plenty of fuel and a whole lot of spite. I think we'll make it. As the ship drifted in the silent, magnetic heart of the Iron Mountain, Kaelen watched the stars on the monitor. They felt closer now, less like distant fire and more like destinations. He thought about the 80,000 marks. He thought about the shop in the Citadel with the clean air and the quiet nights. He realized he didn't miss it. The shop was a cage of a different kind, a comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless. Out here in the dark, with a broken ship and a dangerous friend, he felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He felt alive. The hunt was far from over. Vax Cray was not a man who gave up, and Synaptic Dynamics did not like losing their property. But as Kaelen Vance looked at the Emerald Warrior sleeping in his cargo hold, he knew one thing for certain. They were going to need a lot more than an interceptor to bring them down. The descent into Port Hesperus was a masterclass in controlled falling. Kaelen Vance gripped the manual overrides as the star grays plummeted through the thick, amber-tinted atmosphere of the Rust Nebula. Out here on the fringe of Sector 7, the gases were so dense with ionized iron that the scanners were effectively blind. They were flying on dead reckoning and a prayer, surrounded by a swirling soup of orange clouds that hid jagged spires of silicon and the skeletons of failed terraforming projects. "Watch the pressure, Vance," Zaya 7 barked from the co-pilot's seat. "The hull is groaning like a gut-shot freighter. We are hitting 12 atmospheres and climbing." I know, Kaelen snapped back, his eyes darting between the analog pressure gauges. This old bucket wasn't designed for a deep dive, but Hesperus is the only place where we can lose a synaptic dynamics tail. The magnetic interference in this nebula is so thick, it'll scramble their long-range arrays into static. Zaya leaned forward, her emerald skin reflecting the amber glow of the clouds outside. Her breathing was steadier now, the bypass on her neural damper holding firm, but the lines of fatigue around her eyes told a different story. She looked like a soldier who had spent 10 years on the front lines and had forgotten what a soft bed felt like. "Is this Vane reliable?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble. Most scratch medics in the rim would sell their own mother for a handful of marks. Kaelen shifted the stabilizer thrusters to compensate for a sudden updraft. Eris is different. He used to be a chief surgeon for the Unified Systems before he got tired of patching up corporate hit squads. He's a bit of a hermit now, lives in a repurposed air scrubber in the lower sump. He doesn't care about marks, Zaya. He cares about things that shouldn't exist. Like a Varg class with an intact ego, the ship broke through the lower cloud deck, revealing the sprawling, rusted nightmare that was Port Hesperus. It was a city built on the vertical, a labyrinth of platforms, pipes, and hanging habitats clinging to the side of a massive, hollowed-out canyon. It was a haven for the lost, the desperate, and the people who didn't want to be found. Hundreds of ships were docked at various levels, looking like barnacles on a whale. Kaelen brought the Star Grazed into a landing bay on level 42. The bay was a dank, oil-slicked cavern managed by a 3-armed droid that didn't ask for ID, only for a payment of 500 marks up front. Kaelen counted out the credits with a heavy heart. His stash was dwindling fast. Between the fuel, the repairs, and the bribes, he was down to his last 10,000 marks. His dream of a quiet shop in the Citadel felt like a distant memory, a ghost of a life he had traded for a mountain of trouble. "Stay close," he told Zaya as the airlock hissed open, "and keep that hood up. A Varg walking around Hesperus is like a flare in the dark. People here are hungry, and Synaptic Dynamics pays a hell of a bounty for returned assets." Zaya pulled the dark, reinforced cloak tighter around her massive frame. "I am not a flare, Vance. I am a shadow. If anyone looks too long, they'll lose an eye." They moved through the streets of the lower sump, a place where the air tasted of sulfur and recycled sweat. The neon signs were flickering, casting harsh pink and blue light over a crowd of scroungers, cyber-enhanced thugs, and weary miners. It was a sensory overload, a symphony of shouting, clanking machinery, and the distant hum of the atmospheric stabilizers. Every few minutes, Kaelen caught someone watching them. It wasn't the curious stare of a merchant. It was the cold, calculating gaze of a scavenger. He kept his hand near his hip where a stun baton was concealed beneath his coat. He felt the weight of the bounty on their heads like a physical pressure, a tightening noose that followed them across the stars. "We are being ghosted," Zaya whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of a nearby plasma forge. "Three of them. 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 10 o'clock. Kaelen didn't look. "Don't engage. We are 3 blocks from Eris's place. Just keep moving." The 3 o'clock was a wiry man with a bionic eye that glowed a predatory red. He stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, blocking their path. He was holding a jagged vibroblade, and his smile revealed a row of sharpened chrome teeth. "Nice cloak, big girl," the man sneered, his voice a raspy hiss. "Must be hiding something valuable under there. Maybe some high-grade biomass?" "Synaptic Dynamics is offering 50,000 marks for a Varg in one piece. 25 if she's in bits." Kaelen stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Move aside, friend. We aren't looking for trouble. Trouble is the only thing we sell in the sump," the man laughed. "And you look like you can afford the premium." Before Kaelen could react, Zaya moved. It was a blur of emerald skin and dark fabric. She didn't draw a weapon. She didn't need to. Her hand shot out, catching the man by the throat and lifting him off the ground as if he were made of paper. The vibroblade clattered to the floor, forgotten. The other 2 shadows emerged from the darkness, drawing pulse pistols. Kaelen swung his stun baton, the high-frequency hum filling the air. "Bug out!" he shouted. "Now!" Zaya threw the leader into his companions like a bowling ball, and they didn't wait to see the results. They sprinted down a narrow alleyway, weaving through a maze of steaming pipes and overflowing trash bins. Kaelen could hear the shouts of the pursuers behind them, the sound of boots echoing against the metal floor. He took a sharp left, then a right, diving into a service hatch that led to the sublevels. They slid down a long, rusted chute, landing in a pile of discarded insulation. Kaelen gasped for air, his lungs burning from the sulfurous atmosphere. "Are you okay?" Zaya stood up, brushing the grime from her cloak. She looked remarkably calm, her eyes scanning the darkness for new threats. "I've had worse mornings in the pits. But you are shaking, human." "It's the adrenaline," Kaelen muttered, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "I'm a merchant, Zaya. I deal in spices and scrap, not street brawls and corporate kidnappings." "You are more than that," she said, her voice unusually soft. "You are the man who didn't run when the pistols came out. Most of your kind would have used me as a shield." Kaelen looked up at her, the flickering light of a nearby vent illuminating her face. "I didn't buy you to be a shield, Zaya. I bought you to be a person, and people don't leave their friends in a sewer." The word friends hung in the air, a fragile bridge between 2 worlds that should never have met. Zaya didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. She simply nodded once, a gesture of respect that felt more valuable to Kaelen than all the marks in the Citadel. They climbed out of the insulation pile and navigated the last few blocks to a massive circular structure that looked like a giant, rusted lung. This was the air scrubber, Eris Vane's home. Kaelen knocked a rhythmic code on the reinforced door. A small scanner emerged from the frame, bathing them in a red light. "Kaelen Vance?" A voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "I thought you were dead. The news vids say you were KIA in the Ethel Belt." Reports of my demise were slightly exaggerated, Eris, Kaelen replied. Open up. We've got a situation. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with humming machinery, glowing tanks of bioluminescent algae, and more medical equipment than Kaelen had seen in his entire life. In the center of the room, hunched over a microscope, was a man who looked like he was made of spare parts. Eris Vane had a cybernetic arm, a glass eye, and a network of tubes running from his chest to a portable life support unit on his belt. He looked up, his one good eye widening as he saw Zaya. By the stars, a Varg class, and she's standing under her own power. She's a friend, Eris, Kaelen said, walking into the room, and she needs your help. The damper is bypassed, but it's still in there. It's killing her. Eris walked over, his mechanical arm whirring softly. He circled Zaya like a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. D-series. Synaptic Dynamics really went all out on this one. It's not just a damper, it's an anchor. Can you get it out? Kaelen asked, his voice laced with desperation. Eris rubbed his stubbled chin. It's a delicate operation. I have to decouple the neural nodes one by one. If the system detects a breach, it'll execute a purge protocol. It'll fry her brain before I can pull the plug. Do it, Zaya said, her voice firm. I would rather be a corpse than a corporate asset. Eris looked at her, his glass eye reflecting the blue light of the algae tanks. You've got spirit, girl. I'll give you that. Kaelen, get her on the table, and pray to whatever gods you still believe in. This is going to be a long night. The descent into Port Hesperus was a masterclass in controlled falling. Kaelen Vance gripped the manual overrides as the star grays plummeted through the thick, amber-tinted atmosphere of the Rust Nebula. Out here, on the fringe of Sector 7, the gases were so dense with ionized iron that the scanners were effectively blind. They were flying on dead reckoning and a prayer, surrounded by a swirling soup of orange clouds that hid jagged spires of silicon and the skeletons of failed terraforming projects. Watch the pressure, Vance, Zaya 7 barked from the co-pilot's seat. The hull is groaning like a gut-shot freighter. We are hitting 12 atmospheres and climbing. I know, Kaelen snapped back, his eyes darting between the analog pressure gauges. This old bucket wasn't designed for a deep dive, but Hesperus is the only place where we can lose a synaptic dynamics tail. The magnetic interference in this nebula is so thick it'll scramble their long-range arrays into static. Zaya leaned forward, her emerald skin reflecting the amber glow of the clouds outside. Her breathing was steadier now, the bypass on her neural damper holding firm, but the lines of fatigue around her eyes told a different story. She looked like a soldier who had spent 10 years on the front lines and had forgotten what a soft bed felt like. Is this Eris Vane reliable? She asked, her voice dropping to a low, cautious rumble. Most scratch medics in the rim would sell their own mother for a handful of marks. Kaelen shifted the stabilizer thrusters to compensate for a sudden updraft. Eris is different. He used to be a chief surgeon for the unified systems before he got tired of patching up corporate hit squads. He's a bit of a hermit now, lives in a repurposed air scrubber in the lower sump. He doesn't care about marks, Zaya. He cares about things that shouldn't exist, like a Varg class with an intact ego. The ship broke through the lower cloud deck, revealing the sprawling, rusted nightmare that was Port Hesperus. It was a city built on the vertical, a labyrinth of platforms, pipes, and hanging habitats clinging to the side of a massive, hollowed-out canyon. It was a haven for the lost, the desperate, and the people who didn't want to be found. Hundreds of ships were docked at various levels, looking like barnacles on a whale. Kaelen brought the star-grazed into a landing bay on level 42. The bay was a dank, oil-slicked cavern managed by a 3-armed droid that didn't ask for ID, only for a payment of 500 marks up front. Kaelen counted out the credits with a heavy heart. His stash was dwindling fast. Between the fuel, the repairs, and the bribes, he was down to his last 10,000 marks. His dream of a quiet shop in the Citadel felt like a distant memory, a ghost of a life he had traded for a mountain of trouble. Stay close, he told Zaya as the airlock hissed open, and keep that hood up. A Varg walking around Hesperus is like a flare in the dark. People here are hungry, and Synaptic Dynamics pays a hell of a bounty for returned assets. Zaya pulled the dark, reinforced cloak tighter around her massive frame. I am not a flare, Vance. I am a shadow. If anyone looks too long, they'll lose an eye. They moved through the streets of the lower sump, a place where the air tasted of sulfur and recycled sweat. The neon signs were flickering, casting harsh pink and blue light over a crowd of scroungers, cyber-enhanced thugs, and weary miners. It was a sensory overload, a symphony of shouting, clanking machinery, and the distant hum of the atmospheric stabilizers. Every few minutes, Kaelen caught someone watching them. It wasn't the curious stare of a merchant. It was the cold, calculating gaze of a scavenger. He kept his hand near his hip, where a stun baton was concealed beneath his coat. He felt the weight of the bounty on their heads like a physical pressure, a tightening noose that followed them across the stars. We are being ghosted, Zaya whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of a nearby plasma forge. 3 of them. 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 10 o'clock. Kaelen didn't look. Don't engage. We are 3 blocks from Eris's place. Just keep moving. The 3 o'clock was a wiry man with a bionic eye that glowed a predatory red. He stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, blocking their path. He was holding a jagged vibroblade, and his smile revealed a row of sharpened chrome teeth. Nice cloak, big girl, the man sneered, his voice a raspy hiss. Must be hiding something valuable under there. Maybe some high-grade biomass? Synaptic Dynamics is offering 50,000 marks for a Varg in one piece, 25 if she's in bits. Kaelen stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Move aside, friend. We aren't looking for trouble. Trouble is the only thing we sell in the sump, the man laughed, and you look like you can afford the premium. Before Kaelen could react, Zaya moved. It was a blur of emerald skin and dark fabric. She didn't draw a weapon. She didn't need to. Her hand shot out, catching the man by the throat and lifting him off the ground as if he were made of paper. The vibroblade clattered to the floor, forgotten. The other 2 shadows emerged from the darkness, drawing pulse pistols. Kaelen swung his stun baton, the high-frequency hum filling the air. Bug out, he shouted. Now! Zaya threw the leader into his companions like a bowling ball, and they didn't wait to see the results. They sprinted down a narrow alleyway, weaving through a maze of steaming pipes and overflowing trash bins. Kaelen could hear the shouts of the pursuers behind them, the sound of boots echoing against the metal floor. He took a sharp left, then a right, diving into a service hatch that led to the sublevels. They slid down a long, rusted chute, landing in a pile of discarded insulation. Kaelen gasped for air, his lungs burning from the sulfurous atmosphere. Are you okay? Zaya stood up, brushing the grime from her cloak. She looked remarkably calm, her eyes scanning the darkness for new threats. I've had worse mornings in the pits. But you are shaking, human. It's the adrenaline, Kaelen muttered, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. I'm a merchant, Zaya. I deal in spices and scrap, not street brawls and corporate kidnappings. You are more than that, she said, her voice unusually soft. You are the man who didn't run when the pistols came out. Most of your kind would have used me as a shield. Kaelen looked up at her, the flickering light of a nearby vent illuminating her face. I didn't buy you to be a shield, Zaya. I bought you to be a person, and people don't leave their friends in a sewer. The word friends hung in the air, a fragile bridge between 2 worlds that should never have met. Zaya didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. She simply nodded once, a gesture of respect that felt more valuable to Kaelen than all the marks in the citadel. They climbed out of the insulation pile and navigated the last few blocks to a massive, circular structure that looked like a giant, rusted lung. This was the air scrubber. Eris Vane's home. Kaelen knocked a rhythmic code on the reinforced door. A small scanner emerged from the frame, bathing them in a red light. Kaelen Vance? A voice crackled through a hidden speaker. I thought you were dead. The news vids say you were KIA in the Ethel Belt. Reports of my demise were slightly exaggerated, Eris, Kaelen replied. Open up. We've got a situation. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with humming machinery, glowing tanks of bioluminescent algae, and more medical equipment than Kaelen had seen in his entire life. In the center of the room, hunched over a microscope, was a man who looked like he was made of spare parts. Eris Vane had a cybernetic arm, a glass eye, and a network of tubes running from his chest to a portable life support unit on his belt. He looked up, his one good eye widening as he saw Zaya. By the stars, a Varg class, and she's standing under her own power. She's a friend, Eris, Kaelen said, walking into the room, and she needs your help. The damper is bypassed, but it's still in there. It's killing her. Eris walked over, his mechanical arm whirring softly. He circled Zaya like a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. D-series? Synaptic Dynamics really went all out on this one. It's not just a damper, it's an anchor. Can you get it out? Kaelen asked, his voice laced with desperation. Eris rubbed his stubbled chin. It's a delicate operation. I have to decouple the neural nodes one by one. If the system detects a breach, it'll execute a purge protocol. It'll fry her brain before I can pull the plug. Do it, Zaya said, her voice firm. I would rather be a corpse than a corporate asset. Eris looked at her, his glass eye reflecting the blue light of the algae tanks. You've got spirit, girl. I'll give you that. Well, Kaelen, get her on the table, and pray to whatever gods you still believe in. This is going to be a long night. Chapter 6. The Iron Wind Blows. The surgery had been going on for 5 hours. Kaelen Vance paced the perimeter of the air scrubber, his footsteps echoing against the metal floor. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of the neural scanner. Zaya lay on the operating table, her emerald skin pale under the harsh surgical lights. Eris Vane was hunched over the back of her neck, his mechanical fingers moving with a precision that was both fascinating and terrifying. Every few minutes, a warning light would flash red, and Eris would mutter a string of curses in a language Kaelen didn't recognize. The tension was a living thing in the room. A cold hand tightened around Kaelen's throat. He kept looking at the door, half expecting Vax and Cray to burst through with a squad of corporate enforcers. Steady, Vance, Eris grunted, his eyes fixed on a holographic display of Zaya's spine. I'm at the primary node. This is the part where it gets tricky. Kaelen stopped pacing. What can I do? Keep her stable. Talk to her. The damper is trying to lure her into a neural coma. She needs a tether. She needs to remember why she's fighting. Kaelen walked over to the head of the table. He took Zaya's massive hand in his. It felt cold, the skin dry and rough. Zaya, can you hear me? Her eyelids flickered, but she didn't open them. A low, pained groan escaped her lips. It's Kaelen. We are in Port Hesperus. You are safe. Eris is getting the anchor out. Just a little longer, okay? Zaya's fingers twitched, her grip tightening on his hand. The mountains, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. The sky. 3 suns. Talk about the mountains, Eris commanded. Give her something to hold on to. Kaelen took a deep breath. Tell me about the Iron Wind, Zaya. Tell me about the peaks of Velonis. Was it cold up there? Did the wind really feel like iron? A faint smile touched her lips. Cold. So cold it turned your breath to crystal. We lived in the crags, above the clouds. We were the guardians of the high passes. My father. He taught me to dance on the edge of the abyss. He said a Varg doesn't fear the fall. We only fear the cage. She gasped as Eris made a deep incision. The monitors began to beep frantically. Hold her, Eris shouted. The purge protocol is engaging. Zaya's body began to convulse, her emerald skin rippling with phantom shocks. Kaelen threw his weight over her, trying to keep her on the table. Zaya, stay with me. Don't let them take you back. I'm falling, she cried out, her eyes snapping open. They were filled with a terrifying white light. The cage. It's closing. No, Kaelen roared, his face inches from hers. You are not a slave. You are a warrior of the Iron Wind. Remember the bracelet, Zaya. Remember who you are. He grabbed her left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of her fatigues. The black iron band was glowing, the runes pulsing with a fierce violet light. Look at it, Kaelen commanded. It's still there. They couldn't take it. Zaya's gaze locked onto the bracelet. The white light in her eyes began to recede, replaced by the burning emerald fire. Her breathing slowed, the convulsions subsiding into a rhythmic tremor. "The wind," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "I can hear it. It's blowing. From the north." Eris let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it. The primary node is dark." He pulled a small, jagged piece of metal from the back of her neck. It was covered in green blood and trailing a network of fine, silver filaments. He dropped it into a containment jar, where it hissed and dissolved in a cloud of acidic vapor. Zaya let out a long, shuddering sigh and went limp. The monitors settled into a steady, healthy rhythm. "She's out," Eris said, wiping the sweat from his brow with his organic hand. "The anchor is gone. She's clean, Vance. For the first time in 6 years, she's actually free." Kaelen collapsed into a nearby chair, his legs finally giving out. "Thank you, Eris. I owe you." "You owe me more than Marks, Kaelen," Eris said, his voice turning grave. "While I was in there, I found something that shouldn't be in a D-series unit." He walked over to a console and brought up a data stream. It was a series of complex encrypted files that had been hidden beneath the damper's operating system. "This isn't just a behavior mod," Eris explained. "It's a mapping sequence. Synaptic Dynamics wasn't just using her for labor. They were using her as a biological hard drive." "What kind of data?" Kaelen asked, a new kind of dread settling in his stomach. Eris looked at Zaya, then back at Kaelen. "Gene sequences. Locations of hidden Varg nurseries. Coordinates for a terraforming project in the Forbidden Zone. But most importantly, it's a kill switch. A global command that could shut down every bioconstruct Synaptic Dynamics ever produced." Kaelen felt the world tilt on its axis. "You're saying she's the key to their entire empire?" "I'm saying she's a walking revolution," Eris corrected. "If this data gets out, Synaptic Dynamics is finished. Their stock will crash, their assets will go dark, and the Varg will be free. That's why Vax and Cray is hunting her so hard. It's not about 80,000 marks, it's about trillions of marks and the future of the company." Kaelen looked at Zaya, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time since he'd met her. He had bought a person, but he had inherited a war. He felt small, insignificant, a scrap merchant caught in the gears of a galactic struggle. And then, the turning point arrived. Not with a bang, but with a soft, persistent chime from the ship's remote link on Kaelen's belt. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a message from the Star Gray's internal sensors. "Warning, unauthorized entry in Landing Bay 42. Kaelen stood up, his face pale. "They're here." Eris looked at the screen, his one good eye narrow. "How? The nebula should have masked your signature." "Cray is a professional," Kaelen said, his voice tight. "He didn't track the ship. He tracked the credits. Every mark I spent in the sump was a breadcrumb leading right to this door." He looked at Zaya, then at the door. He had 10,000 marks left. He could take the bypass hatch in the back, run for the docks, and find a tramp freighter out of the sector. He could leave her here with Eris. He could save himself. But then he looked at the black iron bracelet on her wrist. He thought about the mountains of Veloni. He thought about the man he wanted to see in the mirror. "Ares," he said, his voice steady. "How long until she can travel?" "She needs hours," Eris replied. "If you move her now, the neural shock could kill her." "We don't have hours," Kaelen said, drawing his stun baton. "We have minutes." He walked to the door and engaged the magnetic locks. He began piling heavy crates of medical supplies against the frame, his movements frantic but focused. "What are you doing?" Eris asked. "Buying time," Kaelen said. "I need you to finish the data transfer. Get that kill switch onto a portable drive. If we don't make it out of here, the world needs to know what Synaptic Dynamics is doing." "Kaelen, you're a merchant, not a soldier," Eris said, his mechanical arm whirring as he began the transfer. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Kaelen said, looking at the heavy metal door. "But for the first time in my life, I'm not running because I'm scared. I'm staying because it's right." The first blow hit the door with the force of a battering ram. The metal groaned, the magnetic locks shrieking under the pressure. "Kaelen Vance," a voice boomed from the other side. It was Vax and Cray. "You have something that belongs to us? Open the door, and I'll make your death quick. Resist and I'll burn this entire level to the ground just to get her back. Kaelen didn't answer. He stood in the center of the room, his stun baton humming in his hand. He felt the cold iron of the situation, the weight of the choice he had made. He wasn't a hero. He was a scrapper. And right now he was defending the most valuable piece of scrap in the universe. The second blow tore the top hinge from the wall. Sparks showered the room, and the smell of ozone filled the air. "Eris!" Kaelen shouted. "Is it done?" 90%, Eris yelled back, his fingers flying across the console. "Just 60 more seconds." Zaya's eyes snapped open. She sat up on the table, her movements slow but deliberate. She looked at the door, then at Kaelen. "They are here," she said, her voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Yeah," Kaelen said, not looking back. "They are." Zaya stood up, her massive frame towering over the room. She walked over to Kaelen, her steps heavy and rhythmic. She didn't look like a patient anymore. She looked like a goddess of war, her emerald skin glowing in the flickering light. She reached out and took the stun baton from Kaelen's hand. "You did your part, human," she said, her voice full of a strange, terrifying tenderness. "Now, let a warrior show you how to close a deal." She stepped toward the door just as it blew inward, shattered by a shaped charge. A cloud of smoke and dust filled the room, and 3 armored figures stepped through the breach, their pulse rifles leveled at the center of the room. Vaxen Cray was the last to enter. He looked at Zaya, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. "Unit Zaya 7. You have caused a lot of trouble for the shareholders. It's time to come home." Zaya didn't say a word. She simply raised the stun baton and charged. The room exploded into a chaotic mess of blue plasma, emerald skin, and the sound of breaking metal. Kaelen dove behind an algae tank, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched as Zaya moved like a whirlwind, a force of nature that refused to be contained. She took a pulse round to the shoulder and didn't even flinch. She tore a rifle from an enforcer's hands and snapped it like a dry twig. It was violence refined into art, a symphony of rage that had been building for 6 years. "Eris!" Kaelen screamed over the noise. "The drive!" Eris pulled a small, glowing cylinder from the console and threw it to Kaelen. "It's done. Go!" Kaelen caught the drive, his hand trembling. He looked at Zaya, who was currently holding Vaxen Cray by the throat, her green knuckles white with the effort. "Zaya, we have to go." She looked at him, and for a second, the rage in her eyes softened. She threw Cray across the room, sending him crashing into a rack of surgical tools. "Go," she commanded. "To the star grazed. I'll be right behind you." Kaelen didn't argue. He grabbed Eris by the arm and sprinted for the bypass hatch. They slid into the darkness of the sublevels, the sound of the fight echoing behind them like a fading storm. As they ran through the rusted corridors of Port Hesperus, Kaelen felt the weight of the drive in his hand. He had lost his money. He had lost his shop. He had lost his quiet life. But as he heard the roar of a Varg warrior echoing through the pipes, he knew he had finally found something worth keeping. The iron wind was blowing, and for the first time in history, the corporations were the ones who should be afraid. The deep sump was where the air went to die. It was the lowest functional level of Port Hesperus, a subterranean graveyard of leaking conduits, overflowing filtration vats, and the kind of darkness that felt heavy against the skin. Above them, the city hummed with the frantic energy of commerce and survival. But down here, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of condensation and the distant, mournful whistle of the atmospheric scrubbers. Kaelen Vance sat on a rusted crate of decommissioned cooling rods, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He was covered in a fine layer of orange dust and dried green blood, none of it his own. In the corner of the cramped maintenance crawl space, Zaya 7 sat with her back against a vibrating primary pipe. Her emerald skin was dark with sweat, and a crude bandage, made from a strip of Kaelen's spare shirt, was wrapped tightly around her left shoulder where a pulse round had grazed her. She didn't look like a warrior at the moment. She looked like a mountain that had been weathered by 1,000 years of storms, jagged and weary, but still standing. "The drive," Zaya said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the silence. "Let me see it." Kaelen pulled the small, glowing cylinder from his pocket. It felt warm to the touch, pulsing with a faint violet light that matched the runes on Zaya's bracelet. Every few seconds, the light would flicker, and a soft, rhythmic hum would emanate from the casing. It wasn't just a storage device. It was alive in a way that made Kaelen's skin crawl. Eris said it was a kill switch, Kaelen whispered, looking at the violet glow. A global command for every bioconstruct they ever made. But it is doing something else now. Look, he held the drive out. The light wasn't just pulsing, it was broadcasting. A series of complex data packets were bleeding into the local network of the sump, bypassing the rusted firewalls of the city's ancient architecture. It was a beacon, but not one that Vax and Cray could easily track. It was a frequency designed for Varg ears, a subsonic vibration that resonated with the very marrow of their bones. It is calling them, Zaya said, her eyes widening as she leaned forward. It is not just a switch to turn us off. It is a key to turn us on. It is the iron wind, Kaelen. It is the memory of the mountains, broadcast as a digital signal. Kaelen looked at her, a cold pit of realization opening in his stomach. If this gets out, if it hits the planetary relay, every Varg in the sector will wake up, not just as laborers or soldiers, but as themselves. You are talking about a planet-wide uprising. Zaya's hand went to her wrist, her fingers tracing the runes on the black iron band. I am talking about a homecoming. For 6 years, my people have been ghosts in their own bodies. We have been property, assets, liabilities. This drive, it reminds us that we are blood and bone and spirit. Kaelen leaned his head back against the cold metal wall. He felt small. He felt like a man who had gone out to buy a simple meal and ended up starting a revolution. He thought about the 80,000 marks he had lost. He thought about the quiet shop in the Citadel, the one with the white stone walls and the smell of real cinnamon. It felt like a fairy tale told by a different version of himself, a man who didn't exist anymore. We are deep in the skag now, Kaelen muttered, using the street slang of the scrap haulers. If Cray finds us with this thing, he won't just kill us, he'll erase us. He'll turn this entire level into a glass floor just to make sure the signal dies with us. Zaya looked at him, her expression softening in a way he hadn't seen before. You can still walk away, Kaelen Vance. The exit to the sub-docks is 2 levels up. You have enough creds left to buy a ticket on a tramp freighter. You could be halfway to the core before Cray even realizes you are gone. Kaelen looked at her, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw and the fierce, burning emerald of her eyes. He thought about the way she had stood between him and the enforcers back in Eris's lab. He thought about the way she had laughed, just a little bit, when he told her coffee tasted like burnt dirt. And leave you here, with a hole in your shoulder and a target on your head? I am a Varg, she said, her voice regaining its strength. I was built for the hunt. I can survive the sump. Maybe, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But I don't think I can survive the mirror if I leave you. He stood up, his joints popping from the cold. He walked over to her and sat down on the floor, ignoring the dampness and the grime. He reached out and touched the edge of her bandage. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Zaya. My father told me that when I was 6 years old and terrified of the dark between the stars. He said courage is when you are so scared your teeth are chattering, but you do the job anyway because someone has to. Zaya looked at him, her emerald eyes reflecting the violet glow of the drive. Your father was a wise man for a human. He was a scrapper, Kaelen corrected. He knew that sometimes you have to dig through a lot of junk to find something worth keeping. And I found you. The moment was interrupted by a sharp electronic chirp from Kaelen's wrist link. He looked at the display, his heart skipping a beat. It was a broadcast on the emergency channel, a video feed that was being pumped into every screen in Port Hesperus. The image resolved into the face of Vax and Cray. He looked pristine, his black corporate suit uncreased despite the chaos in the lab. He was standing in front of a window that overlooked the glowing orange clouds of the Rust Nebula. Attention, citizens of Port Hesperus. Cray's voice was smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of mercy. We are currently tracking 2 high-risk fugitives, a human male, Kaelen Vance, and a stolen bioconstruct, Unit Zaya 7. These individuals are in possession of a highly unstable viral agent that poses a direct threat to the station's atmospheric stability. Kaelen snorted. A viral agent. That's a new one. Synaptic Dynamics is offering a reward of 500,000 marks for the recovery of the asset and the elimination of the human accomplice. Cray continued. Furthermore, anyone found harboring these fugitives will be considered an enemy of the corporation and will be subject to immediate asset liquidation. You have 1 hour to report any sightings to the nearest security kiosk. The screen went black, replaced by a high-resolution image of Kaelen and Zaya from the bay's security cameras. 500,000 marks, Kaelen whispered, the number feeling like a physical weight. That is enough to buy a moon in the outer rim. Every scumbag and bounty hunter in this city is going to be looking for us. We can't stay in the sump, Zaya. The people here are desperate. They'll sell us for 1/10 of that. Zaya stood up, her height making the crawl space feel even smaller. Then we move, not toward the docks, toward the relay station. The relay station? Kaelen stared at her. That is in the upper spire. It is the most heavily guarded place in the city. It is suicide. It is the only way to broadcast the signal, Zaya said, her voice hard. If we keep the drive here, the signal will die in the pipes. But if we can hit the planetary relay, the iron wind will blow across the entire sector. Synaptic Dynamics will be too busy dealing with 10 million freed Varg to worry about one human scrapper and his friend. Kaelen looked at the drive, then at Zaya. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp, cold clarity that pushed through the exhaustion. He was a man who had spent his life avoiding risks, playing the percentages, and dreaming of a safety that didn't exist. But in the darkness of the sump, looking at the warrior beside him, he realized that he had already found his freedom. It wasn't in a shop in the Citadel. It was in the choice to fight for something bigger than himself. All right, Kaelen said, standing up and checking the charge on his stun baton. We have 1 hour before the whole city turns into a hunt. I know a service shaft that leads to level 14. From there, we can hijack a maintenance lift to the spire. Zaya looked at him, a fierce pride in her eyes. You are a terrible merchant, Kaelen Vance. I know, Kaelen smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a real one. My profit margins are a disaster, but my inventory is top tier. They moved out of the crawl space, slipping into the shadows of the deep sump. They were ghosts in a city of rust, two echoes of a future that the corporations hadn't planned for. As they climbed the rusted ladders toward the light of the upper spire, Kaelen felt the weight of the drive against his chest. It was the heaviest thing he had ever carried, and yet, for the first time in his life, he felt light. The upper spire of Port Hesperus was a stark contrast to the grime of the sump. Here the air was crisp, scented with artificial pine, and filtered to a degree that made Kaelen's lungs ache. The floors were made of polished obsidian, and the walls were lined with holographic displays of surging stock prices and corporate propaganda. It was the heart of the machine, a place where the lives of millions were distilled into numbers on a screen. Kaelen and Zaya moved through the maintenance corridors, their presence a jagged tear in the spire's perfection. They had reached level 89, just 3 floors below the planetary relay station. Every step was a gamble, every turn a potential encounter with a security drone or a corporate patrol. We are close, Kaelen whispered, pausing at a corner to check his stolen map. The primary data uplink is at the end of this hallway. If we can get inside, I can patch the drive into the transmitter. Zaya was tense, her eyes darting to the security cameras that tracked their every movement. She had traded her cloak for a stolen security jacket, though it barely closed across her chest. Her emerald skin looked pale under the sterile white lights of the spire. Kaelen, she said, her voice barely a breath. Look. At the end of the hallway, a large bay window looked out over the Rust Nebula, but it wasn't the view that caught her attention. It was the reflection in the glass. Dozens of red lights were converging on their position, not drones, enforcers. They were waiting for us, Kaelen said, his hand tightening on his stun baton. Cray didn't track the credits. He tracked the air scrubbers. He knew Eris would try to help us. A voice boomed through the hallway's intercom system, smooth and terrifyingly calm. Drop the device, Mr. Vance, and step away from the asset. Vax and Cray stepped out from a side door, followed by a dozen enforcers in full tactical gear. Their pulse rifles were leveled at Kaelen's chest. Cray looked as if he were attending a board meeting, his hands clasped behind his back, a faint, condescending smile on his face. "You have been very resilient, Kaelen," Cray said, his voice echoing against the obsidian floors. "I have to admit, I didn't think a scrapper from the rim had it in him. But this is the end of the road. You are out of sectors, out of creds, and out of luck." Kaelen stepped in front of Zaya, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the weight of the drive in his hand, the violet light pulsing against his palm like a heartbeat. "She is not an asset, Cray. Her name is Zaya." Cray sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "Names are for people, Kaelen. Assets have designations, and this particular asset is worth more than your entire life 10 times over. Give me the drive, and I will let you walk away. I will even give you the 50,000 marks you originally wanted for her. You can go to the Citadel. You can have your shop. You can forget this ever happened." Kaelen looked at the enforcers, then at Cray. The choice was laid out before him, clear and tempting. It was the life he had always wanted: safety, comfort, a world where he didn't have to worry about the smell of fear or the taste of copper. All he had to do was hand over a small piece of metal and walk away. He looked back at Zaya. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. She didn't plead. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, a mountain of emerald stone, waiting to see if the human she had trusted was just another merchant looking for a better deal. Kaelen looked at the drive, then back at Cray. "You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about that shop, Cray. I thought it would make me feel like a person. I thought it would make me someone who mattered." "And it can," Cray urged, taking a step forward. "You just have to be smart. You are a merchant. You know the value of a good trade." Kaelen smiled, a slow, dangerous grin. "That's the thing, Cray. I am a merchant, and I've realized that your credits are worthless. They don't buy anything that lasts. They don't buy the way she looks at the sky. They don't buy the memory of the iron wind." He held the drive up, the violet light illuminating his face. "I'm closing the account, Cray. No more trades." "Kaelen!" Zaya roared, reaching for him, but it was too late. Cray's face twisted into a mask of cold fury. "Kill him. Keep the asset intact, but kill the man." The hallway exploded into a chaos of blue plasma. Kaelen dove toward the data uplink door, the floor behind him shattering under the force of the pulse rounds. He felt a searing pain in his side as a bolt grazed his ribs, but he didn't stop. He slammed his shoulder into the door, the magnetic locks shrieking as they gave way. He tumbled into the relay room, a cavernous space filled with towering servers and glowing data crystals. Zaya was right behind him, her massive frame taking a round meant for his head. She didn't flinch. She grabbed the heavy metal door and slammed it shut, twisting the manual lock with enough force to snap the handle. "Kaelen!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the server room. "The uplink. Now!" Kaelen scrambled to the primary console, his fingers flying across the keys. He was a scrapper, a man who knew how to bypass the locks of 1,000 different machines. He felt the drive in his hand, its pulse growing faster, more frantic, as if it knew it was home. "I'm patching it in," Kaelen yelled, his vision blurring from the pain in his side. 5 seconds. The door behind them began to glow cherry red as the enforcers applied a thermal cutter. The sound of the metal melting was like a scream. Vaccine Cray's voice came through the room's internal speakers, no longer calm. "If you broadcast that signal, Vance, you are committing suicide. The corporation will never let you leave this station alive." "I'm already dead, Cray," Kaelen shouted back, his hand hovering over the transmit key. "I died in that slave market on Onyx 9. This is just the ghost finishing the job." He slammed his hand down on the key. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the entire relay room was bathed in a brilliant, blinding violet light. The servers hummed with a subsonic frequency that made the floor vibrate. On the holographic display, a wave of data began to surge outward, hitting the planetary relay and screaming into the void. The iron wind had begun to blow. Across Port Hesperus, in the mines of Sector 7, in the factories of the core systems, and in the slave pits of 1,000 different worlds, 10 million bioconstructs stopped what they were doing. They dropped their tools. They looked up at the sky, and for the first time in their lives, they remembered their names. The relay room door shattered inward, a cloud of smoke and molten metal filling the air. Vaxin Cray stepped through the breach, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. He looked at the holographic display, watching as his empire began to dissolve in a sea of violet data. "What have you done?" Cray whispered, his voice trembling. "You've destroyed everything." "No," Zaya said, stepping forward, her emerald skin glowing in the violet light. She looked at her wrist, where the iron bracelet was pulsing in perfect synchronization with the relay. "We've started everything." She turned to Kaelen, who was slumped against the console, his hand clutching his side. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, quiet triumph. "We did it," he whispered, a small, bloody smile on his lips. "We closed the deal, Zaya." Zaya walked over to him and knelt down, her massive hand cradling his head. "You did, Kaelen Vance. You are the bravest human I have ever known." The enforcers were frozen in the doorway, their pulse rifles lowered. They weren't looking at Cray anymore. They were looking at each other. They were looking at their own hands, their own emerald skin, as if seeing it for the first time. The iron wind was blowing through them too. Vaxin Cray looked around the room, realizing that he was no longer a director of a corporation. He was just a man in an expensive suit, standing in a room full of people who were no longer his property. He backed away, his face a mask of terror, as the first of the freed enforcers stepped toward him. Kaelen felt a coldness spreading through his limbs, a heavy, peaceful weight. He looked up at Zaya, her face the only thing he could see in the fading light. Did they hear it?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "They heard it, Kaelen," Zaya said, a tear of green brine tracking down her cheek. "The mountains are calling, and we are going home." Kaelen nodded, his eyes closing. He thought about the 80,000 marks. He thought about the shop in the Citadel. He realized he didn't need them. He had done the job. He had found something worth keeping. He had seen a person where the world saw a monster. And that was enough. The violet light did not simply fade. It dissolved into the air like a fine mist, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt as if the entire station had stopped breathing. In the relay room of Port Hesperus, the air tasted of ozone and the metallic tang of static. Kaelen Vance sat slumped against the primary server housing, his hand clamped over the jagged tear in his side. Every breath was a slow, deliberate negotiation with pain. He watched through a blur of exhaustion as the world he knew, the world of ledgers, ownership, and cold corporate logic, shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Across the room, the two synaptic dynamics enforcers who had blown the door stood like statues. Their pulse rifles were still raised, but their aim had drifted toward the floor. One of them, a massive Varg with skin the color of a stormy sea, slowly reached up and unlatched his tactical helmet. The seal hissed, releasing a cloud of filtered air. When the helmet came off, the face beneath was not that of a mindless asset. It was a face etched with a sudden, overwhelming realization. He looked at his hands, then at Zaya, and finally at Vaxin Cray. The silence was broken by Cray. The director was backed into a corner, his face a mask of sweating, twitching terror. His eyes darted from the data screens, showing the spreading signal to the silent warriors surrounding him. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the power to command. And now he found himself in a room where his voice carried no more weight than the hum of a cooling fan. "Kill them!" Cray screamed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate shrill. "What are you waiting for? That signal is a virus. It has compromised your processors. Reset your systems and execute the kill order." The Varg enforcer, who had removed his helmet, did not move toward Kaelen. Instead, he took a step toward Cray. His voice, when it came, was deep and resonant, vibrating with a dignity that had been suppressed for a decade. "My name is Kaelen," the warrior said, his words slow as if he were learning to speak for the first time. Kaelen Vance let out a weak, bloody chuckle. "Looks like names are catching," he whispered. The enforcer looked over at the human slumped against the console. He saw the blood. He saw the way the smaller man was protecting the drive even as his life leaked out onto the obsidian floor. The warrior turned back to Cray, his eyes burning with a clarity that no corporate software could override. "My name is Kaelen," he repeated, "but I am not him. I am of the Blue Crag clan, and you are nothing. Zaya 7 stepped forward then, her presence filling the room like a looming mountain. She didn't look at Cray. She looked at the other Varg, her kin, her people. The iron wind is blowing, brothers, she said, her voice a low command that held no malice, only truth. The cages are open. The choice of what to do next belongs to you. Not to Synaptic Dynamics, not to the Syndicate, to you. The second enforcer dropped his rifle. The heavy weapon clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing through the server room. He stepped toward Zaya and touched his forehead to hers, a traditional Varg gesture of recognition and brotherhood that had been erased from their training manuals. One by one, the other Varg in the hallway began to do the same. The hunt was over. The uprising hadn't begun with a massacre. It had begun with a handshake and a name. Vaxon Cray saw his opening. He lunged for a side exit, his hand reaching for a concealed emergency transmitter on his belt. He was halfway to the door when a massive green hand caught him by the collar and lifted him 3 feet off the ground. Zaya held him there, her expression unreadable. You said assets have designations, Cray, Zaya said quietly. I think yours is prisoner. She didn't crush his throat. She didn't tear him apart. She simply handed him to the newly freed enforcers. Take him to the lower sump, she commanded. Let the people he tried to sell as viral agents decide his fate. As they dragged a screaming, sobbing Cray away, Eris Vane crawled out from behind a rack of data crystals. The old scratch medic was shaking, his cybernetic arm whirring erratically, but he moved toward Kaelen with focused intent. Out of the way, big girl, Eris grunted, pushing past Zaya. I've got a human here who's trying to flatline on me. He knelt beside Kaelen, his mechanical fingers moving with practiced speed. He ripped away the blood-soaked fabric of Kaelen's coat and applied a heavy-duty biosealant to the wound. Kaelen hissed as the chemicals burned into his flesh, but the spreading coldness in his limbs began to recede. You're a real piece of work, Vance, Eris muttered, his glass eye scanning Kaelen's vitals. You had 80,000 marks. You could have been drinking expensive synthale on a beach in the inner core. Instead, you're bleeding out in a relay station because you decided to pick a fight with a galactic superpower. Kaelen looked up at the ceiling, a faint smile on his lips. Best investment I ever made, Eris. Zaya knelt on the other side of him, her massive hand resting gently on his shoulder. The violet light from the relay was still pulsing in the room, reflecting in the emerald of her skin. The station is in chaos, Kaelen. The signal has reached the planetary relay. Reports are coming in from the mining levels. The guards are defecting. The Varg are walking out of the pits. Good, Kaelen whispered. Tell them to be careful. Freedom it's a heavy thing. It is, Zaya agreed, but it is our weight to carry now, not yours alone. For the next 2 days, Port Hesperus became a city in transition. The expected bloodbath did not happen. Most of the corporate staff fled to the docking rings, escaping on luxury shuttles before the Varg could organize. Those who stayed found that the monsters they had feared were more interested in finding their families and learning their history than in seeking revenge. The planetary government, realizing that Synaptic Dynamics was effectively bankrupt and that their primary security force now consisted of millions of freed, highly trained warriors, quickly declared Port Hesperus a free territory. It was a political maneuver to save face, but it gave the movement the legal breathing room it needed. Kaelen spent those days in Eris Vane's clinic, drifting in and out of a medicated sleep. He watched as the news vids showed the iron wind spreading across the sector. He saw images of Varg warriors tearing down corporate banners and replacing them with simple hand-painted symbols of mountains and wind. On the 3rd day, Zaya came to see him. She wasn't wearing the stolen security jacket anymore. She was wearing a simple tunic of rough-spun cloth, and the black iron bracelet on her wrist was polished until it shone like a star. We are leaving, Kaelen, she said, sitting on the edge of his medical cot. A fleet is gathering, 7 freighters and a dozen smaller haulers. We are going to Velonis Prime. Kaelen sat up, wincing as the biosealant pulled at his skin. The homeworld? I thought it was a corporate wasteland. It was, Zaya said, but the signal included coordinates to hidden nurseries and seed banks that synaptic dynamics thought we'd never find. We are going to reclaim the mountains. We are going to see if the iron wind still blows. She looked at him, her gaze intense. Come with us. You have no shop in the Citadel. You have no credits. You are a man without a country, Kaelen Vance. Be a part of ours. Kaelen looked out the small, scratched window of the clinic toward the orange clouds of the Rust Nebula. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who counted marks and looked the other way. He thought about the cage in Bay 42 and the long, cold walk through Onyx 9. I'm a scrapper, Zaya, he said softly. I'm not a warrior. I don't know how to build a world. I only know how to fix the broken bits. Zaya smiled, and it was a look of such profound warmth that it made the sterile clinic feel like home. Then you are exactly what we need. We are a broken people, Kaelen. We need someone who knows that even the most damaged soul is worth the price of admission. Kaelen reached out and took her hand. His was small and pale. Hers was massive and green. But as their fingers intertwined, the difference didn't matter. They were just two people who had decided that the world shouldn't have cages. Let's go see those mountains then, Kaelen said. I hear the air is better up there. 3 months later, the Star Greys drifted into the high orbit of Velonis Prime. From the cockpit, the planet looked like a marble of deep indigo and jagged white, a world of towering peaks and frozen oceans that had survived the predations of corporate mining. It was a harsh, beautiful place, the kind of world that didn't care about the petty ambitions of men. Kaelen Vance sat in the pilot's chair, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He was thinner than he had been on Onyx 9, and a silver scar traced a jagged line across his ribs, but his eyes were clear. The hoarse cough of the station air was gone, replaced by the crisp, recycled oxygen of a ship that was finally heading in the right direction. Behind him, the cargo hold was no longer empty. It was filled with boxes of medical supplies, packets of hardy alpine seeds, and the personal effects of the 40 Varg refugees who had chosen to travel on the Stargraze. The ship hummed with the sound of voices. Not the low, frightened whispers of slaves, but the boisterous, chaotic noise of a people planning a future. Zaya stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the northern hemisphere. There, she said, pointing to a range of mountains that pierced the cloud layer like the teeth of a dragon, the Iron Wind Peaks. That is where the first settlement is being built. Kaelen adjusted the thrusters, bringing the ship into a descent trajectory. I've been looking at the topographical maps, Zaya. Those passes are going to be a nightmare to navigate once the winter storms hit. We're going to need to reinforce the habitat domes with heavy-duty thermal plating. I know a gearhead who is very good at finding solutions to impossible problems, she said, bumping her shoulder against his. Kaelen laughed. Yeah, well, he's going to be busy. Eris is already complaining that the atmospheric stabilizers I salvaged are pre-war junk. We will make do, Zaya said. We have learned to live with less. They descended through the atmosphere, the Star Greys shaking as it hit the high-altitude winds. These weren't the stagnant, sulfurous updrafts of Port Hesperus. They were clean, powerful, and cold. As the ship cleared the clouds, Kaelen saw them, thousands of tiny lights flickering on the mountainsides. The Varg were home. They were building, hunting, and living in a way that had been stolen from them for generations. Kaelen brought the ship down onto a natural stone plateau. The landing struts groaned as they settled onto the granite, and the engines whined down into a peaceful silence. He hit the button to cycle the airlock, and for the first time in his life, he didn't check the sensor array for pursuers. He didn't check the credit balance on his wristlink. He just stood up and walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold of the airlock, the cold air of Velonis hitting him like a physical blow. It was sharp, biting, and tasted of ancient snow. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the vast, uncaring beauty of the peaks. I used to think that freedom was a place, Kaelen mused, his voice carrying in the crisp air. I thought if I could just get to the Citadel, if I could just buy that shop, I would finally be free. I spent 10 years measuring my life in miles and marks, always running toward a horizon that never got any closer. I thought I was being smart by looking away from the cages, by telling myself that the misery of others wasn't my business, as long as my ledger was in the black. But standing here with the wind in my face and a scar on my side, I realized I was the one in the cage all along. I was a prisoner of my own fear, locked in a cell built of convenience and cowardice. He took a step out onto the stone, his boots crunching on the frost. My father used to say that the most expensive thing you can buy is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror afterward. I didn't understand that until I saw Zaya in that bay on Onyx 9. I didn't realize that by choosing to see her as a person instead of a product, I was finally choosing to see myself as a human instead of a merchant. We are not defined by what we own or the laws that try to name us. We are defined by the moment we decide that someone else's dignity is worth more than our own safety. I've lost 80,000 marks, a career, and a quiet retirement. And in return, I found a world that is bigger than any shop and a family that is stronger than any corporation. I finally stopped running, and for the first time, I am exactly where I need to be. Zaya stepped out beside him, her emerald skin vivid against the white snow. She took a deep breath of the mountain air, her chest expanding as if she were trying to swallow the entire sky. "It is beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," Kaelen agreed. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the three suns that were currently setting behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold, violet, and crimson. "What do we do now, Kaelen Vance?" "Now?" Kaelen looked toward the flickering lights of the settlement, where children were playing in the snow and fires were being lit for the evening meal. "Now, we get to work. We have a world to fix." Zaya reached out and touched the black iron bracelet on her wrist, then placed her hand on Kaelen's shoulder. "Together," she said. "Together," Kaelen repeated. As they walked toward the fires of the new world, the iron wind blew down from the peaks, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a tomorrow that hadn't been written in a corporate ledger. Kaelen Vance, the man who once thought he was a merchant of spices, was now a builder of dreams. And as he looked at the massive emerald warrior walking by his side, he knew that the deal he had made in the stinking markets of Onyx 9 was the only one that truly mattered. He had traded a life of quiet desperation for a life of dangerous hope, and he wouldn't change a single second of it. Kaelen leaned down and picked up a small, jagged piece of white quartz from the path, tucking it into his pocket as a new kind of treasure. He turned to Zaya and smiled, the three suns of Valonus Prime finally dipping below the horizon to make way for a sky full of endless, unclaimed stars.